Hello and welcome to David's Politics Show. As we approach the 75th anniversary of Israel's independence, the country is in a state of domestic upheaval. Netanyahu's so-called judicial reforms have led thousands of Israelis to take to the streets in protest. With me to understand these fast-moving developments and what is at stake is Professor Chuck Freilich, former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor and a longtime senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He is the author of 3 books on Israeli national security, most recently Israel and the Cyber Threat, How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power. He is also, I'm delighted to say, a returning guest on this podcast, and I encourage the listeners to check out the previous episode, which was on the long-term consequences of 1967. Professor Freilich, a lot going on in Israel at the moment, so thank you very much for taking time for this.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So, as I said, even just in the last 48 hours, a lot has happened. Just to recap for maybe the listeners who are not 100% up to date. So, the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant gave a speech in which he voiced some concerns, to put it mildly, about the so-called judicial reforms. There's a package of legislative changes, very far-reaching changes. Maybe we can get into the details in just a second. Netanyahu's reaction was to fire him, which led to, as far as I understand, really a spontaneous reaction on the part of really thousands of Israelis who took to the streets in a very peaceful way, I have to say. I mean, when one compares what is happening in Israel now, where it seems to me there's a lot more at stake, with what is happening in France, I think it reflects favorably on at least part of the Israeli body politic. But anyway, enough from me. Let us hear from you. You're there. You're in the thick of it. Give us your sense of where we are at the moment. Netanyahu is, as far as I understand it, agreed to postpone at least some of the legislative changes. But give us your take on where we are right now.
Well, first of all, 48 hours in Israel at the moment is an eternity.
Yeah.
And in those 48 hours, actually, the defense minister, Gallant, came out and expressed strong support for the reforms. He just said that the process has to be slowed down so that this can be done in a more consensual manner.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, he was summarily fired. Only 24 hours later, the prime minister then announced that he was slowing down the reforms. He was temporarily suspending them until the end of the Pesach recess, so for about a month. And that's it. So why was he fired? And interestingly, under Israeli law, a ministerial firing enters effect only after 48 hours from the time that the dismissal takes place formally. It still hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there is at least significant chance that this will simply be allowed to dissipate. The prime minister won't say, "Oh, I didn't fire him." He won't say, "I did," and just somehow life will continue. And there is a chance that he will remain defense minister.
Okay, so you think it's possible that Netanyahu would say he was misunderstood or something along those lines?
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit hard to say he was misunderstood, but in the
Right.
Total state of insanity that we find ourselves at the moment, just about anything is possible.
Right. I mean, that reminds me a little bit of the comment that I think it was Smotrich, or maybe it was Ben Gvir. I confuse the two sometimes, but one of the two made this comment about quote unquote wiping out a village, which seemed pretty literal, and then he managed to somehow claim he had been misunderstood. But
right, that was Smotrich, and it's not the only case recently when people have tried that stunt.
Right. Tell us a little bit about the protests. As I said, they've been remarkably peaceful considering what's at stake. But what is your sense of who is participating in these protests, kind of sociologically, demographically? Which aspects of Israeli society are sense that a lot is at stake here? That really it goes to the heart of what the state of Israel is about.
Well, I think what people feel is that Israel's fundamental character as a democracy is at stake here. Now, it started off being, let's say, a center-left demonstration or series of demonstrations. And over time, it broadened so that there were a fair number of people on the center-right and even people from the right who were coming out at least against the process, the fact that this was being rammed through at breakneck speed without any serious deliberation.
Mm-hmm.
And so the protests at least partially changed their complexion. And I think that this was a case of overreach in general
Mm-hmm.
in every area. But one of the areas of overreach is that they succeeded in mobilizing the Israeli silent majority. They certainly succeeded in mobilizing the liberal or more democratic camp.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been quite surprised, actually. I mean, in my family, I'm jokingly known as a chronic malcontent because I've been protesting for many years. But as my wife and I have noticed over the last couple of years, we used to say that and I won't divulge my precise age, but I am no longer young.
Okay.
And so we used to say that we're the youngest in the crowd. Now you see the young people turning out in droves.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who oppose the legislation, that is, of course, a very good thing because if this is going to be stopped, it's going to be stopped by the activists, the young people who are activists, who are really willing to get out there in the face of the police, peacefully,
Mm-hmm.
but in their face, to block the highways and the roads, to do things that people like myself, who stand politely on the side, do not do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, including what we've seen in maybe the last week or so is also significant sections of the reservist force of the army, right, have
Right.
really taken quite explicit action, either not refusing to turn up for sort of regular training, that kind of thing, or actually, I saw, for example, today a picture of, I think it was naval reservists who organized a kind of impromptu flotilla, as it were, of protesters. So, and that also kind of undermines the argument that Netanyahu was trying to make, right? Trying to paint the protesters as basically left wing activist types, or in some sense not patriotic, right?
Absolutely. I think what we saw here is really the entire, first of all, the defense establishment, and secondly, the people from Israel's most elite, most incredible military units, the reservists at least, coming out and saying, no, this it's a step too far, stop.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw a couple of former heads of Mossad, the former head of the Shin Bet, the former head of the Atomic Energy Agency, all coming out and publicly saying this is a threat to Israel's democracy. It has to stop. And then you saw reservist pilots, and 60% of Israel's Air Force pilots are reservists. You saw many of them coming out and saying, we will not serve a less than democratic government. If this goes through, we won't show up anymore. You saw the most elite commando units. You saw the naval reservists, as you were indicating, launching actually a series of flotillas from the and technologically advanced intelligence unit, the cyber units. It's really the cream of Israeli society. I think this is actually something which can be very proud of. It's who turned out. And by the way, it's not just who, it's not thousands of people demonstrating, it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Over the last couple of days, some of the numbers were 500,000 people. And I know how to do the math, at least in American terms. You have to multiply that by 40 to get an equivalent number in the US. It's never happened.
Yeah, no, it's significant numbers for sure. Okay, so as you mentioned, there's this kind of suspension over Pesach. What is your sense? Is Netanyahu making kind of a tactical compromise because he senses that he's lost momentum, as it were, or do you think that momentum has really fundamentally and permanently shifted the other way, and that the legislative package as it was originally conceived will not be able to go through?
I mean, that's a very good question, and I don't have quite as good an answer for you because none of us know what's going through his mind at the moment. I think his decision-making process in recent months has been highly questionable and irresponsible. And I say that he's a man, by the way, of great achievement in the past, and he has certainly proven himself to be a master politician over decades. And at times, he's been a very good prime minister, or at least in some areas. So we have to give him credit for that. I don't think he intends to stop now. Um, in the end, I think what really is motivating this whole thing is he's trying to subvert the judicial process so that he won't go to jail.
Yeah.
And his trial in the court in Jerusalem is proceeding, and of course, innocent until proven guilty, and he's fully entitled to his day in court. But he is behaving as someone who seems to think that the end is pretty clear. So I don't think he'll stop completely. We've seen in the last couple of days they put through this outrageous chametz law that you can't bring chametz, bread
Hmm.
products, into hospitals during Passover. Today they submitted the law which will allow him and any politician or senior public official to get presents for legal or medical purposes. Now, there was always an exception to the ban on that in unusual cases. Really, this is simply a way to make pretty much any corruption now legal. So they're going ahead with some of the non-fundamental judicial reforms, the things that people said would subvert Israel's very democratic character. But this is just rampant corruption and totally unacceptable stuff.
Hmm.
And we may, I emphasize the word may, have a brief respite, especially with Pesach coming up. But there are already demonstrations scheduled for this week, and I don't think it's going to let up very much.
Hmm. So I'd like to ask you about, in a sense, a kind of longer term or a longer perspective kind of question, which is, as you mentioned, a lot of it is really just Netanyahu, the individual who has his legal troubles and is kind of trying to squirm out of them in any way he can. But I'm interested in how we got here in the sense of how Israeli society has developed. Because, of course, historically, one of the main cleavages in Israeli society was that between the more secular Jews and the religious community, which originally was much smaller, has grown significantly. But it seems to me, and I'm curious what you would say about this, is that this particular fundamental clash doesn't neatly map onto that secular versus religious divide, right? It seems to me that there are also religious Jews among the protesters, for example, and maybe also some more kind of what were thought of traditionally as secular Jews, also including Likudniks, who are kind of gung ho, gotta ram through these reforms through the Knesset. Well, what's your sense of what this cleavage in Israeli society says about how the Israeli body politic has developed over the last couple of decades?
Well, as I said, the complexion of the demonstrations changed over time. And we saw people from the center right, and we saw religious people as well. Small numbers. Let's not overstate the case, at least the religious. The right wingers we can't identify visually. But yes, this became much broader than the initial population, but it still has a certain overall political complexion to it. Look, Israeli society has certainly been changing. We've now had a couple of decades in which the ultra Orthodox parties, uh, well, I'll use the loaded word, extorted disproportionate um, um,
Privileges, or
yeah, privileges and financial transfer payments for their constituencies.
Mhm.
And when you're having 6 to 10 kids per family, and when the secular population, which by the way, by Western standards, has a very high birth rate, but it's 2.7 or something. Uh, well, over time, that changes things. the current projections show that by 2060, something like 30% of the Jewish population may be the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim.
Hmm.
Now, if that is the case, that is, I believe, and this is certainly a judgmental statement, I believe that will be a severe threat to Israeli democracy. It will be a threat to national security because they don't serve. And it will be absolutely ruinous for Israel's economy. We can't, there's no way that the productive part of Israeli society can keep bearing a burden for 30% of the population.
Hmm. Yeah, sure. I mean, at some point there are mathematical limits to this arrangement. But yeah, it's so interesting precisely because, as you said, it goes to the heart of, in a sense, two different conceptions about what the state of Israel ultimately is, right? Is it an essential characteristic of the state that it be a democracy, or is that a kind of feature that you can have or not have, and it doesn't matter so much, right? That's really what it seems to be all about ultimately.
Well, there's always been the dual definition of Israel as both a Jewish state and a democratic state. Now, there are people on both sides who are willing to forego one of those fundamental attributes. I personally find both of those approaches totally unacceptable. Israel was established to be a homeland for the Jewish people, but to be a democratic state. No compromise on either one of those principles.
Hmm. Let me switch gears now slightly to talk about how this is affecting Israeli national security and its foreign relations. What is your sense of how other powers in the region are viewing events? We've seen Hezbollah chirp up a little bit lately. How is Iran viewing the situation? Are they maybe thinking about taking advantage of it in some way?
Well, funny you should ask because I wrote a tongue-in-cheek op-ed about a week ago, which was as if a urgent memo from the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards to the supreme leader Khamenei, say, and to make the short story was, Mr. Supreme Leader, it's wonderful. We can sit back. Why waste billions on weapons and other things to fight Israel? What do we need this nuclear program? The Israelis are destroying themselves. So let's sit back and enjoy life. And I mean, again, it was a satirical piece, but I think it's actually quite reflective of what's probably happening today in Tehran and what Nasrallah feels and Hamas feels. This is a catastrophe for Israel's national security from every perspective. Um, as it is, there are growing tensions on all the fronts. Hezbollah launched an attack about a week or 10 days ago, a terrorist attack, the kind of thing that they haven't tried to do in many, many years. The Iranians are continuing their efforts to set up their own military presence in Syria and increasingly to transfer weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. They have deployed missiles in Iraq and Yemen. Hamas is probably chomping at the bit, waiting for the right opportunity to launch its next round of rockets, but it's also got some constraints on it. And there's been an uptick in terrorism in the West Bank. And there's a danger of all of these fronts converging, and Israel could find itself in a multi-front war anytime in the near future. That's what Gallant, the defense minister, was warning about. That's what caused him to take the stand that he did. Now, add to that the fact that Israel's international standing, which was not wonderful before this, has taken a very severe hit because people are looking at us in astonishment at what's happening here, the country coming apart. In the US, there is a great deal of criticism. And
Hmm.
then domestically, yeah, I said the country is coming apart. We were talking before about reservists who the most elite, the best reservists saying that they won't serve a government of this type. The IDF, I can't believe I'm even going to say this, but I've said it repeatedly in recent days. The IDF was in serious danger of unraveling.
Wow.
This is something which is unimaginable.
Yeah.
Okay. People are It's not just the reservists who are refusing to show up. It's the regular army professionals who are saying, I'm going to go and ask. There is a possibility to ask that your service contract, be nullified, and they want to leave service, or saying, all right, I'll run out my current contract, but I'm leaving. I don't want to be a part of this.
Mm-hmm.
And it even has made inroads into the conscripts. And there's talk about real tensions in all sorts of units. And you see the chief of staff and the other generals and deeply, deeply concerned and trying to keep a lid on everything. You saw the head of Mossad, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, who allowed Mossad employees to demonstrate as long as they didn't identify, of course, as employees,
Mm-hmm.
because they were demanding it. They were saying, allow us to demonstrate or maybe we're quitting. So
Wow.
it's hard to imagine what this has done, and the sense that people had of the country literally being on the verge of a cliff, maybe, by the way, on the verge of a civil war, or at least considerable violence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of what led to the incredible backlash that led. Yesterday, there was a national strike declared jointly both by the Labor Federation and most of the employers' associations. They don't normally work together
All
very
right.
closely.
Right. Yeah.
So there was a big backlash of Israeli society saying, "Wait a second, guys! We've gone too far. Let's put an end to this before it becomes really unacceptable."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me quickly kind of take advantage of the fact that you're here to ask you to kind of give us a tour d'horizon of what's happening in the region. Very quickly on Iran, Syria. Obviously, Iran has been trying to make inroads and pass weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to other militias in other places. Is there a sense at all, do you think, among the kind of in the national security circle, let's say in Israel, that Israel's position in terms of Russia's war against Ukraine has maybe started to lose its strategic advantages, in the sense that Russia has been significantly weakened and has had to actually buy drones from Iran. We know about those, and maybe there have been other deals. And of course, Iran is asking for something in return. They're not doing it for free. Do you think there's a sense that maybe Israel's interest is not in kind of standing back and not getting in Russia's way too much, or is that still, do you think, the prevailing view?
No, I think it's the prevailing view, and this is one of those cases where I think the government has actually gotten it right. Look, of course, Russia has been weakened, but Russia is still a superpower. Let's not forget that. And sooner or later, this war will end, and Russia will rearm and remain a highly influential player in the world and in the region. Now, if you ask me on an emotional level, I'd love to get up and say exactly what I think of the Russians and what they have done, and I would have very strong words to say.
Mhm.
But once you're done with the emotional response, then there's realpolitik. And the reality is that the Russians are still in Syria. They have an S-400 there, which is one of the most advanced anti-aircraft, anti-missile systems in the world. They continue to be one of the primary, together with the Iranians, the two primary players in Syria, and they can help strengthen the Iranian presence there. They can play a really unconstructive role in the nuclear negotiations with Iran, taking their side on all of the issues. They could, even if they really want to, they could provide Iran with nuclear assistance to help them complete the process. And Iran is very, very close. And just today, there was a report that they've actually supplied them with some rather sophisticated new cyber capabilities. Uh, Russia remains a great danger for Israel. Now, in balancing between what Israel would like to do and the realities of the ground, it's taken, I think, a reasonable approach, which is to provide Ukraine with generous humanitarian assistance by Israeli standards, with vests, with helmets, with also a field hospital for a while, all sorts of other things. I don't think we can afford to do much more. Yes, I think we could give them some more, let's say, civil defense or home front help, some more medical help. It could even be an IDF medical unit. But I wouldn't even go to defensive weapons, let alone offensive ones.
Mm-hmm.
Price is just too heavy.
Okay, very interesting. Finally, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the rapprochement, as it
Right.
were. Maybe that's too strong a word. Of course, mediated by China. How is kind of the Israeli national security establishment viewing that, especially China's involvement?
Well, I won't try and speak for the national security
Okay,
establishment. I'll
fair
tell you
enough.
my own view.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Um, Look, first of all, the Chinese came in here towards the end and helped broker the final deal, something which was in the making for the last 2 or 3 years. Now, is this just a one-off? They took advantage of a certain situation and they came off, of course, looking good here. It is the first time that they have ever led a major strategic realignment in the region. So is this a one-off, or maybe we're beginning to see the Chinese era in the Middle East?
Mm-hmm.
China has been a major economic player in the region for decades because they buy vast quantities of oil, both from the Iranians and Saudi Arabia, but they never really played a diplomatic role of consequence, and their military role is also very limited. They have a small deployment in Djibouti. But now, the first time they lead a strategic realignment. I think for the Iranians, this is, of course, a major achievement. If it happens, by the way, which is, it's not at all clear that this will really materialize.
Mm-hmm.
It won't be the first agreement in the region which is declared and then doesn't materialize. But let's assume for the moment that it does. For them, it's a big win because they've lowered the tensions with, if not their primary, one of their two primary adversaries in the region. They've dealt a blow to the U.S. position in the region, to the U.S. leadership, and the joint American-Israeli attempt to build a regional axis, or maybe that's a strong word, a regional alignment to counter Iran. And they have, at a minimum, postponed, if not disrupted, Israel's attempts to promote normalization with some more Gulf states, especially the Saudis. So I think for them, this is a big victory for the Iranians, and we'll see how it plays out.
Yes, absolutely. Well, fascinating. We'll leave it there. I think this has been a great overview of both what's happening in Israel at the moment, a lot going on there, but also, of course, the neighborhood doesn't sleep, and
Not at all.
events keep happening. I want to mention for the listeners who may want to follow Professor Freilich, his work and his interventions in the public sphere. You can find more information on his website, chuckfreilich.com, on Twitter at Chuck_Freilich, and also on YouTube. Just search for Chuck Freilich there. Professor, it's been a pleasure talking to you again. Thanks as always for your time.
Thank you very much, and Chag Sameach.
תודה רבה.